last thing I heard.
Yeah, well, that's pretty much all. That it just kept happening, right? I have a visual that I think will just tell my story better.
No. Don't do that.
That's what it's like on my side. That's what it looks like to me.
No, that's not fair. That's not fair. It's reasonable, but not fair.
It's just facts aren't fair, are they? Facts, facts are the worst.
You've hurt my feelings, Nate. Stop. You've hurt my feelings. Stop. That's where this ends.
I'll read the court transcript. I'll read the court transcript. Me, he looks so stupid in that fucking hat. What even is it?
No.
Asanda, it's a fedora with safari flaps on the side.
Okay, well, at least I got sorted out the sound for now. If you're all ready, I think we should just begin and just start talking about that infamous day.
Yeah, let's do 1 minute quick. Douglas, Asanda, any idea if Colin's planning on joining us, or is there?
Colin will not be joining us. We received a big shipment. He's been asked to just assist with just confirming with the person who shipped it, and then I do know he has some purchasing to do for one of our projects for Monday. He needs to get some stuff shopped as well. So he will not be here.
Where are you right now, homie?
Did you?
Yeah, I got your audio on that. Your video is kind of scattered.
I'm at our office.
Okay. I thought you guys were done early on Fridays. What happened to
that? Work. In this case, I could actually say work happened. But we are closed.
Oh, okay.
So Sean claims he's on his way, but I don't know what he hasn't given a further update. So yeah, that's it for us today then. So when Sean jumps on, we'll see if he. I'm nervous. Not nervous. I guess we can do this. I think Colin has an interesting little bit of info that would be nice to have, but I don't think it'll deter from the story. Thoughts from you guys?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think we should just go ahead.
Yeah.
Cool. Can't wait to relive these photos.
Well, I got video as well.
I believe you.
But starting out, it's the 10th of June, 2020. Following some severe rains, we had some flooding, and that's the setting.
Yeah, and sorry to put you on the spot, Asanda, but we all kind of did a lead into this last week when you were off, or 2 weeks ago. Just kind of like describing a bit of like what we were doing and what our engagement with Philippi Village was. And then we spoke a little bit about some of the background of Philippi Village. Not a lot, because I think that story of like how we constructed security is going to happen another day. But in terms of what we didn't get to capture that I did want to capture was what were you were the one that was most opposed to taking that contract, and I wanted to see if you'd be willing to just explain that a little bit, because I think it's important, and I think history may have proven you right. So just to explain what we were saying is like, here's what we were being told, here's what we were being offered. Long story short, we were excited by the opportunity to put a lot of our energies and efforts into a central location, And then we, in spite of not being an agency that was set up to create security agencies, decided that based on what we were experiencing, our survey of security and our own plethora of experiences in community security mixed with digital implications and innovation into security, behavior change work, and programming, thought we could kind of house that all at once to have a mutually reinforcing effect on safety in a building and a setting that was claiming to want to be an asset to the public of Philippi, which is one of the most underserved and violent spaces in the most violent city. So what we didn't get was a bit of the cynicism part that we also had to work through, because I think your voice was the most clear and the most certain that this might not be a good idea. Would you mind talking about that for a few minutes?
Yes, definitely. So my issue was, at the time, not even, and as I think about it and I thought about it at the time, I didn't have as much of an issue with Philippi Village. I mean, we had a long relationship with them and we learned things and understood them better. But I think I'd been so jaded. I was just jaded at the time and averse to situations where, to me, it felt like we were doing a whole lot more give than get. And even if we weren't getting, I wanted to at least feel like we were respected. And at the moment, taken care of well. And my previous, I guess, I packed my feelings on the agreement that we were putting together with the treatment that we got from the Department of Community Safety docs, and then some of the treatment we were getting with some of our partners at the time as well, and then putting that together with the agreement that was being put together with us and Philippi Village. And I remember the one phrase I kept saying was, I feel like they are eating our lunch. I don't know if I said that or if you remember me saying that, but that's the phrase that comes to my mind. I feel like we are having our lunch eaten. And I just don't feel like this is going to be a relationship where we are going to be fulfilled, at least as far as the partnership sides of it. I do, in hindsight, feel that it was at times fun and at times interesting, and I do not regret us going into it, but I was never happy with the terms of the agreement and the terms of the deal, because I felt that they should have been paying more into the whole project than I felt like they were. I didn't think that we were being met halfway. I do know that at the time we'd agreed verbally, and in terms of organizations, I feel like we were pretty aligned, at least in that early stage, but I wasn't feeling it in the breakdown of the agreement. And so I just was not happy, numbers to numbers, based on what we envisioned we'd be paying in and what they would be paying in, and the ultimate outcome that we said we both agreed to. It felt like it was us putting way more into it than we were going to get out of it. And that was my principal issue with it was we were going to get way less out than we were putting in. We were putting in a lot. And that, combined with all my feelings and hurt and betrayal by the Department of Community Safety and by some of our other partners and other agencies that we were working with, I just was not comfortable with us throwing ourselves into another relationship that I felt wasn't going to be fair to us.
Yeah. And I suppose good context to that, just as a 1 minute is like their negotiation of that contract was super shifty. I mean, they kept sort of changing the terms. We had to keep changing the stuff. We had to race to get it done, and then when we got it done and we had an agreement, we and got to the table, then they tried to change all of it on us last minute, which then we had to do because at that point we didn't have to do. We could have walked away, and maybe should have, because that ended up being the way all negotiations went. But that's a story for another day. And but at the time we were like, well, we've already invested all of this idea work, all of this, all of these sort of concepts. We were all bought in, and I suppose weirdly, at the end of the day, the biggest problem possibly with the safety lab and our decision-making process is, and this is going to sound silly given the texture of our culture, was that we were very emotional. You know, if we were emotionally bought into an idea, we would make a lot of excuses to get that idea off the ground.
Mm-hmm.
I think because like once we sat down and analyzed the problem and we found what we thought to be an ignored solution to that, we just felt an obligation to execute that, at least to test and find out if we were right and if that could solve a problem that nobody was solving. And so, yeah, I think you're right. I think the negotiation, their buy-in, their investment in it, and everything else ended up being a lot less than they verbalized. Mm-hmm. We should have listened to their actions and not their words.
Yes, and but I think that's a good point, Nick. I think that we are emotional, and even though I was probably the most verbal and adamant about let us not do this, when we were in it, I was in it. I won't pretend as if I pulled myself out and I was on the side. No, I jumped in. We all did, and I was happy, and I'm happy that we did, because it was an amazing experience, and we'll never have anything like it again, God willing. But I'm happy we did it because now we know at least a little something about what that process is like, and so I'm genuinely happy we did it. But if we hadn't done it, I would have been probably equally as happy, if I'm being fair.
I'm happy we did it, but if we hadn't done it, I might be happier than I am now. All right. I won't belabor that point because I think we have to talk about we have various projects within that we're going to end up talking about in depth, but that's just the lead into how we end up walking into a land invasion in the beginning of COVID as we're deploying our first security team in Philippi Village, which gives us the mandate and the responsibility in our minds to respond to this problem that Douglas has queued up on screen here. And Douglas, at some point, as we show these close-ups of Waterfront, I think we also need to kind of zoom out so that we can kind of give a sense of the perimeter and what's going on there. Because as much as I know exactly what I'm looking at now, to anyone else, I don't know what that looks like.
Yeah, let me do that right now. Actually, share this tab instead. There you go. So here we are, Philippi Village, in all of its glory. So what happened is mid to early June, it would have been around about the 8th of June, that week, they had particularly heavy rains, or we had particularly heavy rains in Cape Town, and this pond, zooming in onto the Philippi Village area, got filled up. It was dry for years because we had actually just come out quite a long period of drought, and so that pond was sort of very dry. And in the previous 4 or 5 months, people had started moving in and settling in on that pond, that area which would become that pond. basically that whole area around Philippi was experiencing a rapid influx of new residents, squatters. And when the rains came, that pond naturally filled up because it was a retaining area. And the people who had chosen to settle, illegally settle in that pond area got flooded and they got displaced. And that caused, and I actually got some photographs of that actually. Bear with me, for some reason, Google keeps on kicking me to different sort of chronological times. Which makes it a bit more difficult to sort of reorientate and find myself. But yeah, that's the background. And do you want to say anything?
Yeah, sorry guys, I had to switch to my headphones. Are you still hearing me clearly?
Yes.
Okay. So while we have this screen up, I think it's important context to acknowledge that 2 years before this, none of this settlement existed. And that is actually how the CEO of Philippi Village got her job while we were working there. And so she'd come in as a community negotiator in order to prevent them from moving on to Philippi Village land from what they thought was government land, but actually was Oasis land. Oasis is a development company in Cape Town. So all of that water, even up to where all the concrete fencing goes, that's all part of the retainer pond. So that pond is meant to just retain all the water from the flat that they're on, and some of the water coming off of the street. So the drainage comes through into there to kind of be retained over the wet months. And so people started moving into this land about a year to 2 years earlier, and they were just creeping into the Philippi Village land, just north of the screenshot. And so they negotiated a way to give up about, a couple hundred square meters of their land in exchange for negotiating and providing toilets, and a little bit of land, but that allowed them the safety to put up this 8 to 10 foot concrete fence around their land as people were building their houses on it. And so that is what you see here. Is there were these large concrete slabs that surrounded the what they came to term the waterfront community, which was named because of the retention pond. And so,
and also in classic Cape Town fashion, named after a nice famous place to refer to, I suppose, a not so nice place, and that place is the V&A Waterfront in Cape Town.
Victoria and Alfred Waterfront, sort of one of the colonial outposts that England left behind in multiple countries. But in this case, they named it the Waterfront, which was just a purely informal, isolated, and kind of like, not just isolated, it sort of, what's the better word there? It holed up, like because of the concrete fence that Philippi Village put up on two sides, because of that Vibercrete fence you see behind the man in the orange jacket there, which goes along Better Life, and then because of C and Ghana, another informal settlement, there was no way really in or out of Waterfront safely for anybody or without trespass. So we had a bunch of proposals at the time that included safe passageways for Waterfront that would sort of also build up, I guess, a little bit more positive relationships with the community that might come through Philippi Village, but those were rejected all in all by Philippi Village, because they just didn't want to mess with this wall. And so that led us straight into a very strange period, a culmination of the onslaught of COVID and the lockdown, which in South Africa was severe. South Africa's initial 5-week lockdown was basically nobody's allowed outside except to buy groceries. No one is allowed in each other's homes, broadly speaking. There was a little bit of like that kind of Soviet level tell on your neighbor stuff if they're doing anything. And not just in the way that I think the larger world talks about it now, where it's like tell on your neighbor if they've got huge parties. This was like tell on your neighbor if they take their dog for a walk kind of stuff. There was no cigarette smoking allowed, which is a story for another day. And there was no alcohol. Alcohol was prohibited for at least initially 3 months. So all the liquor shops and restaurants and everything were completely shuttered. The only businesses that were largely allowed to operate were those considered emergency services and the grocery stores. So no one was working. No one was supposed to be leaving their house unless they absolutely had to. And we were in the middle of a wet month. And that's when we were tasked with initiating the security, as well as this land invasion situation. And by land invasion, what we mean is people started to move onto the vacant Philippi Village land, if we could show that quickly in a map, in order to build extra houses because they were being flooded off of the property with all the rain. So you see along, that's the section they particularly wanted to move on to. And the problem was Philippi Village had just decided to put a larger investment into developing their property for greater use, including things like building a soccer field, building basketball courts, putting together a farming project that would help train community members, and so on. So we could not do that. They did not want to give up that land. I mean, aside from the fact that it belonged to them. And the community had seen this land go vacant for years, so they decided it was up for grabs. And so that was the combination of things that led to this initial problem we dealt with immediately upon taking over the responsibility of securing this property.
Yeah, it was so. It was the weirdest. And if I'm not incorrect, we got on in 2020, right? If I'm not mistaken.
We first arrived, it would have been about the beginning of 2020, but we first started looking into it in late 2019.
Yes. So this was I guess, for me, a heck of an introduction to, the space security and everything. And I think it came at a very weird time being in COVID. But I do remember us knowing and being, I guess, very conscious, actually, because at the time when we initially were doing some of our deeper engagements, Douglas, and you'll remember this quite well, there was quite a bit of surveying work we did in the beginning with that community in particular.
That's right. Yeah, we preempted it with a survey of the general area, so that we sort of knew what was going on, and it was actually in the community, and it was actually part of our strategy of security. This sort of layered approach where we would understand what's going on in the surrounding area, we would secure the premises itself, and we would kind of aid the security of the premises by ensuring a level of, or helping ensure a level of stability in the surrounding community.
Yeah, and so Colin at the time, I know, and some of the team as well, had already worked on, trying to build deeper relationships. And I do think it's worth mentioning that quite a few of the security officers on our team were actually from this community. About, if I had to put it at a percent, I think about, Nate, correct me if I'm wrong, 40% of our team was from this community?
It might have been more. I mean, it was kind of hard to know because I'd say more than, I think like 60% of our team was from the larger Siangana space. So to know how many were Waterfront and Siangana was a bit tricky, even at times for them, because they were often new transplants and didn't know where their own boundaries were. But we had a large, thank you for raising that. I mean, our prep work involved a lot of community engagement of all of these neighborhoods, including the informal settlement you see behind Philippi Village in the top corner of the photo there, and other settlements nearby. So we did a stock take of like what's going on in those neighborhoods, what are their priorities, what's going on there. I remember our long day hanging out with the farmers to understand what's going on there. That became part of our pitch, because there's this section of that top settlement that has a series of sort of livestock farmers in it, and how can we add value to their lives, and how can we give them access and make sure that there's fair access to different spaces. We pitched an additional gateway in the back so that they could possibly let their animals kind of graze along Philippi Village land, because we thought that might also do two things: build community relationships and add a bit of charm to that back space. So with all that said, we had done a stock take, and we'd been out in the neighborhood sort of building relationships amongst various people in those communities to see what do they want from Philippi Village, what would make us good neighbors, but beyond that, help with development and safety in the communities that were abutted to the property.
Yeah, and so the reason, and thank you very much for that, because I think that's very important detail. Because we've done so much work in terms of the engagements with a lot of these communities, basically any community directly touching Philippi Village, we'd already been there. We'd kind of already worked on, okay, who are the key role players? What do they do? Who should we go to talk to? Who knows what? And who can we bring in? And then we have a lot of team members on our team from the community as well. And I wanted to bring that up because I think that we had unlike I think a lot of neighbors and a lot of spaces in Cape Town that deal with land invasions, we've done a lot of work in terms of trying our best to understand who's around us, in terms of just, the general community members, but also we'd known and built relationships with the individuals from there, which allowed us to, before the invasion even started, we'd already been doing our own surveys of the space, and we'd already begun the process of actually tracking the level of damage and the level of flooding, the water level more specifically. I think at the time we were walking that community and had our security team at the time giving us status updates, and on a daily basis for sure, but on days when it was raining, we'd been actually checking in quite frequently in terms of the updates in our security group and tracking, okay, where are the water levels at, how many more houses are affected that we can kind of tell from the updates we're getting. And then I remember at the time, and this, I might be wrong about this one, Nate, but I feel that we were already working on figuring out a solution for them at the time, unless I'm mistaken.
Well, we were building a solution because we were trying to come up with sort of things that would reduce insecurity in the community as a function of our larger neighborhood block, right? And I'm laughing a little bit because I'd forgotten that we were doing those walkarounds already, and how Philippi Village found that that made them insecure, and a little angry at us. But I do also remember grabbing some guy on my first walk around and going, "Can't live there, man."
Yeah, guys, it's not gonna work out.
I was like, "Dude, that's gonna flood in a couple months. So get out of there." Move that. He was building his thing right in the middle of the watershed, and I was like, "No, man, no." And he was like, "What?" And I asked a couple of community members why is he doing that? And they're like, "I don't know." And I was like, "No, but you guys, who's running this place, man?" And the community leaders would be like, "Oh, we are." And I'd be like, "Yeah, but why are you letting him do that? It's gonna flood." And they would be like, "I don't know." Yeah, teach their own.
Every walk around, it wasn't, I mean, And I think it's important. I know you mentioned Philippi as an area, and this area particularly experienced quite a bit of rapid growth. But I think it would be good to mention just how fast it was growing. Douglas, can you go? Do you have any internal pictures? Okay, that's good. That's good. So that is a picture of the pre-built homes that some of the people were using, and so it wasn't. For some of them, it was being built bit by bit, but for a lot of them, they had these street sales along the main road. That was, I think, Douglas, on Galvin Becky.
Yeah,
This
that's
picture
right. That
is
was. I think it was on Ems Way, Governor Becky Ems Way.
No, that's Eisleben. That's an Eisleben
Yeah, you're right.
sales
It's
point.
Eisleben. Yeah, this is Eisleben, and they were selling. It was like a cluster of carpenters selling prefabricated shacks to sell to people who were moving into the area and setting up shacks essentially because the population growth is so rapid that
Yes.
there was a business opportunity here, right? And they would just basically literally take these shacks, move them a couple hundred meters away from where they would buy them here for a few $100,000 and put them down and stake a claim.
Yeah, and so that's how fast these communities were growing, that they had businesses doing these half prefab spaces. And so every walk around, nearly, at least more than once a week, mate, I think, there was someone building lower. Always. Every walk around, there was a new home being built further down, closer to what had already been reined in at the time, I remember.
Yeah, I think there was like 3 or 4 new houses, new dwellings being built at any given time we were walking through. I remember that was the time when no one expected to see anyone in there, and we just would get catcalled, and everyone would like yell to us, "Hey, what are you want what you want, man?" But so it was rapidly building in the sense that, one, they were also dismantling, and what you can kind of make out here is the lines that used to be fencing, and sort of they had put, like, there was originally this large sort of, like, it's not chainmail, but one of those metal-based fences that was around this waterfront that they started taking down in order to build their own things, right? So they were ripping out concrete, ripping out that fence, because now it was kind of both cordoned in, which was the term I was trying to remember earlier, by Philippi Village's cement wall, as well as by other buildings. So there was no purpose to this fence anymore in their minds. So they were just ripping that down and using it to build houses. And so it went from not existing to having several hundred, maybe more, people living in it. I can't remember what our eventual estimate of members of that community was, but it was somewhere near the mid. I want to say it was like like above 1,000, which sounds crazy now looking at it again. But that's there were so many people living to each house, so many kids playing in that.
Yes.
Effectively sewage pond. And so, yeah, long story short, it was a crisis before it was a crisis. And we kind of knew it was going to be bad at some point. And also the thing that we needed to try to figure out a solution to, if we were going to create any sustainable security in the space.
Yeah. And so we'd already been working with them. We'd done the survey, and we'd already been checking up on this flooding issue in particular. Like you said, we'd been doing walkarounds, going through, chatting to people, and we'd already known that the water was an issue before winter really started, because we saw the early signs very quickly that, okay, this is not going to be good. And I remember that season was going to be particularly wet. And Douglas, I'm sorry, I know that you've got your screen shared. Were you able to open the document I shared? Apologies, because there's a nice.
No, you haven't. You haven't granted me access yet.
Apologies. Did I send it via email at least as a PDF? And I'm sorry if I'm holding us back, but there's a really good picture
Not unless
of one.
You sent it in the last 5 minutes.
Oh, let me grant you access now, Douglas.
Oof. Oof.
Quickly.
I'm looking at
there's
it. I've opened it.
Yeah. Give me a second, Douglas. I'm granting you access right now because there's a really good picture in there that will just show what it was from the inside, looking towards Philippi Village. You have access now, Douglas. And so I think that, yeah. And so that's what it became. I think, if I'm not mistaken, within Nate weeks, right? From when it started, when we started doing our, okay, we got to check in on this all the time now.
Well, we hit it. Yeah, I think what happened was, and I could be a little wrong. We might have to go back to 10 years ago, weather patterning and reporting. But what if memory serves, we hit COVID around April, right? Early April.
Yes.
Was when our lockdown sort of came from nowhere in South Africa, because we had no data on COVID. We had no real sense of where we fell in the larger COVID thing. But when the US and England said they were going to lock down, South Africa went, us too. And
yes.
The problem there was we had an early wet season, I think. Usually that comes in, later in the June, July months. But we had an early series of rain during the COVID lockdown, which then we know every year some flooding happens. And we knew that was a flood area. And so that was our initial concern, even when we really weren't very much allowed outside. Back then, I was probably the only one on the team really doing a lot of driving around, because I was doing the refugee work as well as I was mobile. I had a car. I had no responsibilities at home. So and we had our emergency services certificates. So I was going back and forth to check on this, and even before everyone got back on the ground, this was becoming a problem.
Yeah, and Douglas, that picture I love, because it shows exactly. Yeah, this is it.
I almost said favorite, but it's the most descriptive.
Yeah, there's one of those pre-built homes, which would have been built, I imagine, weeks before the water reached it. If that.
Yeah. I don't think that one. Yeah, that was one that got abandoned, right? It just, yeah.
Yeah. Pre-built home, but you can see the doors, the windows, which means they got far enough to complete it, but there's no way. So I'm looking at the distance because I'm explaining quickly. The houses to the right are on the, if you are facing Philippi Village, and those towers, they are obviously towards Philippi Village. The houses towards the right are on the left side of the walkway that you use to get through this end of the community. So we're all the way on the right-hand end. And so these were the original barrier, because there were houses on the far right of that. Then there was a walkway, and then these houses on the right are the ones who are facing into that walkway. And so this is what the community was in terms of early days. And I imagine these were some of the guys that had already known about flooding and had built, towards the end of the wall. And then we obviously, as you can see from the picture, then had people building even beyond that boundary that these guys had set, as okay, this is high enough up. And then we had people now building further and further in, and this was the result, essentially. Once anyone building on that fourth tier was just messed up immediately.
So I know we have really specific images of all of these properties, because we actually catalog each flooded house later on.
Yes.
But if Douglas, is there any way you can zoom in?
We had yeah, sorry.
I was just going to see if Douglas can zoom in a little bit toward the silos, because you can see that other part, which gives a better description of how many houses. Yeah, just lower than that. Do you see those houses there that are all flooded over? That entire section was, I figured that entire section of it also became flooded. You see the water rising over over those houses in the back there. So, and then what I also like about this photo before we move on is, I remember we were walking through it every day, just checking on the water levels. And I remember being yeah, I mean, if I were here, I would be looking at Philippi Village with a lot of like, what now? You know, look at even just in this was the weather every day, and the water level rising, and you're just looking at this sort of industrial structure in the back, which is Philippi Village, that just looks super sturdy, dry, and unconcerned, and it's next door to you, right? So that was the tension and the crisis at the moment.
Yeah, and so I guess because of all of this, I don't think we'd or at least I had not imagined that the land invasion would happen. And I think Nate, you might have obviously definitely thought about it, but I didn't imagine that they would choose to break through the wall over, moving further up, even though there was no space further up, or just finding a new place, which is what we were telling a lot of the community leaders / members that we were engaging with in the early days, which was this isn't a place that's going to be reasonable for you. It is going to flood. It's raining now and the flood has subsided, sure, but we have, worse rains upcoming, winter's coming, and it's just going to get worse. And so I didn't think that our engagement meant they wouldn't come over, but it was one of those things or moments where, everything's going well. If I can speak about the day itself, everything is kind of going well. We've got the security team kind of checking up on things. And I love this picture because you can see Nate on the left with his work bag on him. Because I remember this was it our security team who notified us of this? I think it was definitely our security team, right? Definitely.
Yeah. No, that's a great real quick touch point.
It was our
is
security
like,
team.
To your point,
and
right? It was like,
I think
right.
all at the office.
In the morning, I think when Ricardo got there, he gave us the report. Ricardo's the man standing next to the gentleman in orange. He was our security lead at the time. And he got there in the morning for shift change and informed us. And I remember my first response being a bit pissed because it was like, okay, when? And they're like, last night. It's like, when, bro? How did we allow somebody to rip a cement wall down without it becoming an incident report, right? But I think at the time because of the rain, because of everything else they didn't really do a scrutiny on that back. That's the very back corner of Philippi Village, basically, right? And so they were probably doing patrols at random times and not really tracking that particular sort of unused space as frequently as they should. And so, but that's about 6 a.m. And my other response was, yeah, okay. Yeah, that seems like the kind of crisis we're going to have.
Makes sense.
And so, yeah, but it was like, okay, now we all got to head out there. And the other, that gentleman that's at the furthest, I mean, if I'm looking at the screen, the furthest left in the hole is a reporter that the CEO had called to try to report on what's going on, which they thought would empower them to put pressure on the city or what they did, unbeknownst to them, Oasis at the time, to have a solution because they didn't want to pay to fix their own wall. And those are the guys that just randomly and horrifically both badly picked the worst quotes and then also misquoted me. So I won't forget them for that. So yeah, that's the picture you're seeing here is the initial hole that they ripped out using some sort of drill. As you can kind of see along the bottom there, they just kind of drilled holes and then tried to rip it out. And broadly speaking, they succeeded in getting some corrugated steel ripped out, or corrugated concrete ripped down so that they could start trying to get off of that space.
Yeah, so
and
Nate,
Sean is,
I've actually got a video of you trying to talk to people.
1 second, Douglas, if
Yeah.
you don't mind. I do think that it would probably be very important for Nathaniel to explain, and I'd love to hear again what you arrived to. What was it? Because I think this picture is focused on, where the issue happened. But when you came on, I remember that you walked up to something way different than this.
I think I think you might be thinking of even the second land invasion, because that was bananas.
Yeah. Sorry.
This one,
Okay.
this one was kind of low key. Like, security honestly had done a decent job of kind of corralling everyone and saying, "Wait, the bosses are going to come discuss this." So you got to hand it to Ricardo, because like I do think he managed to kind of like plug this, literally and figuratively plug this hole, because he's the one standing in it at the moment. And so then we went early morning, someday it was like 8-9 a.m. to go engage and figure out what's going on and what this level of the problem was, right? And so it was, you can see Leslie there trying to chat as well. In this photo, you're not seeing the number of community members, but Leslie is there sort of engaging as well with the 20, I want to say, or 30, maybe a few more than that, community members that had corralled around this space to figure out if they could move themselves onto Philippi Village land. And the negotiation in that first day really was them claiming they just wanted to get off of the waterfront for a while, right? Their claim was, we just want to move onto the property briefly while this flood happens. And our response was, this flood isn't going down anytime soon. And legally, Philippi Village won't allow that, because then they won't be able to, they won't be able to remove you if you don't leave. But we had to find a gracious way to put that, because Philippi Village was adamant that they couldn't and wouldn't allow anyone in. And to give some background to that, like, this is a continuous problem in South Africa. And the minute, I think the legality, and Douglas might know this better than me, but the legality around it is, if the structure is standing for more than 24 hours, then it is now a house. It is now a home.
I think it's 48 hours, but yeah, it's like
48
hours.
So 2 days.
Yeah, but basically once it's been there for 24, 48 hours.
Overnight.
They've got squatters' rights, or they've got a type of squatters' rights. And in order to move them, it becomes a really big issue, including the possibility of needing to find alternative accommodation for them. So you got to kind of, you as the landowner have got an onus to rehouse the people who are squatting on your land. And so that's why they're really desperate to avoid people moving onto the land, because it becomes really difficult to remove people once they're there.
And so there's this sort of, I remember this was that day, and it was like 5 different negotiations that went on throughout that day. And so we would give some information, talk about what the potential answers might be to this, and we were really approaching it like, how do we solve this problem? Not so much like, oh, these guys are bad and we need to punish them or treat them in some way, like they're trying to take from us. It was more like, okay, guys, look, we agree with you, this is a disaster, and we agree with you, you can't continue living here. Unfortunately, we also cannot allow you to move on to this property, because it has a development plan, and because it belongs to this particular owner, and they are not willing to give it up, and we won't be able. And again, I was trying to find a way to say this graciously. We won't be able to negotiate this situation if we do allow that to happen. It'll become a legal issue, which will be beyond our control. So that was sort of back and forth that day. But I think the important thing, and contextually, is that this was sort of happening in various places throughout the city, especially during that period when the police were neither wanting to go out themselves because of their fear of COVID, and having to do all this extra work. They were expected to do so much more crowd management as a function of the new regulations that came through COVID. So now people weren't allowed to stand next to each other. People were getting beaten in the streets by police. The military were out pointing guns at people, and threatening and arresting people who just didn't understand the rules of standing in line for a grocery store, right? And all day, the grocery stores were confined to like an 8-hour operation period. And so people would just be lined up around blocks for hours waiting to get into grocery stores. And the cops were expected to manage that across the city of 4 million people. And our police are not designed for that. And maybe we'll get into more of that another day. But so the situation going on. Oh, please, man. You're going to kill me, Douglas, this article. So this is an article by Ground Up about our particular issue, which was not unique in Cape Town, but I suppose the details are unique, but the issue is not. And so our job was to try to navigate this land owned effectively by a corporation, owned by a billionaire that currently resides in the UK, and his expectations with the CEO's expectations of the space against the community's needs and desires and expectations of that space. And we had to negotiate that for hours and hours that day as it was pouring down on everyone. That's my best effort at the sort of like broader context. And so Cape Town, for those who are just looking in on this, if we ever do show it, is a town that is substantially informal, meaning lots of people living in informal, unofficial houses, sometimes shacks, sometimes worse, in broad swaths throughout the city. And if you fly into Cape Town, you'll see townships along the way at various levels of development that include everything from what you're looking at here to government houses to some private development houses. And I'd say if we had to guess by population, at least a third, maybe a half of the city's population lives in that general environment. Geographically, it's a whole large chunk of the south, or mostly the, I guess, south and east.
It's the south and east. It's the informal settlements used to dominate the area south of the airport, but they've become a bit more formalized over time. And now the new informal areas are these areas just below and to the east of the airport. So that Delft area, Blue Downs, Khayelitsha, etc.
And we are, if you keep it this scale, right in the heart of all of it.
Yeah.
Down,
so
down. Yeah. That's Nyanga. Down. Yeah. There you go.
Yep. Yeah. We're just below the airport, so just below Nyanga by Brown's Farms, and that's really, yeah, right there. That's where we are. We're this sort of open space. We're like one of the last left open spaces in an ocean of overpopulation.
So, and if you look at this other open space next to us, that's government. That's part of that's part of a broader like police station / courthouse / whatever is over there.
So this the neighbor, so the open space neighbor over there is traffic. I think that's a traffic impoundment lot. So the traffic department for the Western Cape government.
So they're able to police that fairly easily as they are police.
Yeah.
So,
yes. Metropolitan Police Station, Philippi. Yeah.
And even with that, like they still allowed this community north of them to be developed in about a year, right? So
that happened. That happened in the year that we were there, for sure. The first year that we were there.
So that's the background context that anyone needs to know about why this sort of crowding becomes land invasion, becomes this informal setup, becomes this property battle, and becomes this legal dispute that Douglas kind of articulated. This what became colloquially, I suppose I should say, is like a 24-hour deadline that people would put on it in their heads, because once that gets over 24 hours, there was no certainty that the legal system would sort it out, or that the police could come and do anything about it if you called them. And so our main goal was to prevent this from becoming a police affair. If we failed as a security agency in preventing them from moving on, the police were going to come in, or worse, what they call the Red Ants, which is a private security company that the police contract to be very, maybe I shouldn't say brutal, but certainly dispassionate in the way that they destroy houses, remove everyone from the land, dump all of their stuff, and all at gunpoint and paramilitary format. So our aim was to avoid that. Generally speaking, our aim was to avoid having weapons on site at all, including state weapons, at least not drawn. We had to obviously have police officers come and go, but to avoid the drawing and use of weapons of any kind at any point. Sort of psychologically and ethically, we thought that would create a safer zone, a zone that the community more broadly understood, both passively and actively, as a safe space for them to do what they needed to do, and for us to be able to run successful development projects there without the fear and risk of violence on a regular basis.
And so that involved you trying to talk to people and and give a little speech, for example. So,
oh God, no.
Here's a video I took of you trying to talk to them.
Well, that's Ricardo. Let's be clear.
Yeah, so that's Ricardo. But you're the one talking. The sound is not so great because of the wind.
Can you volume that up at all more? I guess it's immaterial what I'm saying. Maybe not, but I can probably try.
You're basically saying the city of Cape Town.
Yeah, I'm basically walking through the situation, which is complicated. I mean, we've just spent 20 minutes going over the difference between the city's interests, the land developers' interests, the Philippi Village interests, the waterfront interests, and I'm trying to walk through why this, not to mention our interest as a security company in avoiding conflict. And obviously I'm not putting it in those terms, but that's what I'm trying to walk the community through as a function of sort of cause and effect situations we're going through now to try to avoid the problematic behaviors that might come, as well as it might be worth noting, I don't speak Xhosa. And it's a Xhosa community, right? Mostly people coming from the Eastern Cape who principally, and in some cases only, speak Xhosa fluently. So we're having a translator from our team. There's Theo trying his best. From our former team. Funny enough, we should note Theo was an original activator of our youth services in Nyanga, and then became a skateboard coach later on. Including for us as running skateboard programs in both Nyanga and then in Philippi.
What was the response from the crowd?
So they
gave a couple interesting responses.
I mean, a lot of it was just kind of like demands. I went through some of them earlier. What the actual negotiation became was, we just need to get off of this today. We need a place to be today, and we don't want to move onto your land. Why aren't you listening to us? We're telling you we don't want to move on. I mean, this bore out differently later on, and we know that wasn't necessarily true, but that was their argument: was we're not asking to move there, we're asking to stay there, and my response was, we cannot do that, because we are because the owner is insecure, effectively. Again, not the words I used at the time, about the implications that would have. And then the knock-on effect that I had to offer them was the police will be called. You guys may be arrested. You may lose your homes. You may lose these other things if you do this. If you choose to settle on this land without our permission. I want to be careful about using the invasion as a term, although that's like the colloquial term we've used, and obviously it makes sense to a lot of people, and it is effectively like physically what's happening. It's that it wasn't really our perspective that this was particularly an invasion. It was more that we had to reconfigure the boundaries. We had to rework and negotiate the solution, and that included managing and helping people to understand what our thinking was on this. And as much as I respect and appreciated Leslie's participation in this, and she even came through with us at times because she was so excited by our engagement with the community. Leslie was one of the facilities managers at Philippi Village. So, but when she would get into a negotiation, she would very quickly become kind of threatened and start shouting back at people, right? So having to manage her through their shouting process, because a lot of it would be simultaneously somebody from the community trying to explain what was bothering them and what they wanted, while also trying to rile up the rest of the community, right? So there was a number of times where it became a very loud and shouty conversation because we're in the middle of a field, not a field per se, a little plot of land that is being flooded with 30 people, and everyone wants to hear every argument. So volume sometimes became emphasis, and a lot of tensions were growing. So you're seeing me negotiating with one of the community leaders there, and he's representing their points of interest. And that's why we had to keep breaking up throughout the day. They would all go back to a meeting they wanted to hold to rediscuss what they're talking about, given the information we would give, and then we would recede back to Philippi Village while watching the breakthrough in the wall to sort of strategize what can we do. And you guys may not remember this, but before the end of the day, I had to run out to whatever camping store was open and buy like 40 tents. And I don't remember how many places I went to get them. I found a tent that was affordable online that we could buy at like Game or Macro, and went out and bought as many of them as I could.
Why'd you do that?
So that people could sleep out off, because the houses are literally flooded. It's not just that the rain is soaking everybody's house and coming through their roofs and whatnot, which is a perennial problem in the entire neighborhood. It's that probably, I think we ended up finding out through our canvas that at least 30 houses were flooded to the point where people couldn't go in and out of them. And so we had to find at least as many tents to house as many people out of the rain as possible.
I suppose many people would ask, why did you take that on yourself and make it your problem?
Soft negotiation, right? So we're trying to, 1, be good neighbors, 2, be understanding and empathetic with the situation they're in, and 3, protect the property. One of the main arguments in the negotiation was always, well, what else are we supposed to do? We have nowhere to go. We have no houses. We have nothing to sleep under. I'm getting wet now in just talking to you. And although we knew that tents wouldn't last long and wouldn't be a long-term solution to that, we just needed to try to create one that would solve this 24 to 48 hour argument from both sides. So I was able to pitch that Philippi Village needs to invest, I think it wasn't too much all in all, it was a couple thousand, some thousands of rands, less than 10, to give a solution to this that will allow us to avoid an overnight or other opportunistic moments where people might then come back onto the land and try to move on. There's good and bad to that part of the story. The good is it did settle all of these immediate crisis tactics that were being used in this negotiation. 2 is those crisis tactics they were using to create an emergency that they felt could only be solved by moving onto the land were largely made up. And so we did give them the tents. We handed them over to the leadership, but I think only a handful of them were used that day. And then they planned on, I think, like selling them on the street So then Philippi Village got offended by that and then used it as leverage to pull the community leaders' cards. Like, this is what you said you needed. You gave us this list. You gave us the number of people that needed tents, and now they're not being used and they're being sold. You now need to return them. So for that,
so essentially, it sounds like the leaders were taking advantage of the desperation of people by profiting off of them.
Oh, no, it wasn't the leaders that were selling them, to my knowledge. It was the people.
Oh,
that
so
were
people
organizing to sell the tents. So
you would give tents to the people who said they needed them because they were flooded out of the shacks, but instead of using them to remain dry, they would sell them on the streets.
But they were planning on it, because I have to say planning, because again, this is kind of like an intelligence gathering process at that point, right? It's that we see them not using it. We saw them kind of organizing, and maybe one or two did get sold in the, like on ice leaving. But then it was that because they're not being used, and because we can see that this is now being remarketed, that tells us that the community leaders' negotiating points were false. So
yes,
they were telling us that. Yeah,
so
they were telling us that this was,
in other words,
right.
That.
I don't think they were doing that on purpose. I think they were just trying to represent what the community was screaming at them. Right? They were in. You got to imagine you're in a tough spot. You're in an informal community with no formal leadership process. They were just kind of anointed leaders that have been there forever, not forever, for 2 years, which in Waterfront terms is an eternity. So they were kind of like just leadership by nature. So they were representing the community and representing their concerns. But on the other side of it, they're just trying to keep people happy themselves so that they don't get into trouble with the community. So I don't think it was disingenuous, their argument. I think it was a relay, more or less. And they didn't know how to negotiate. I mean, to be fair, like, it's not like there's a training process for becoming an informal settlement leadership member, right? It's more like you find yourself there, you're considered there for a long time, an old head in the neighborhood, and people start coming to you, and then you kind of loosely over time organize a group of people that represent that, and then over many years you might develop an actual leadership process. But at the time, because of how new the community was, leadership there really was kind of new in many ways. They weren't really used to the leadership process, weren't really used to managing and navigating this kind of community crisis, and didn't know how to represent their community interests while navigating and being as powerful as they can be toward a corporate entity like Philippi Village. So I hesitate to blame them.
So in other words, it was a type of failure of very, very localized community governance, like community leadership. Not of the leaders themselves, but rather of the norms and situation of selecting leaders, representing their interests, and then communicating that with people.
Sorry, guys. There's no formal negotiation of who's a community leader that's written down in like municipal law, right? So there's no process by which this happens. It just develops organically from community to community.
Yeah. Especially in these new communities which have organically sprouted up.
Yeah, and Sandra wanted to jump in and add something.
Yeah, I think it's actually, in this case, guys, worth mentioning, and apologies that my camera isn't on, but I think it's worth mentioning that in this case, the previous negotiations and communications of people off what was Philippi Village's land to beyond the boundary they drew was with the Siangena community. And so they'd already had a leadership group in those members, but those members had no interest in what was becoming Waterfront at the time. And so I think there was a little bit of issue there as well that might be worth mentioning. I'm not sure, Nate, you'd have to let me know.
And just to be clear, Siangena is this slightly older community just at the entrance of Philippi Village, which was just outside of the wet area. So it was a dry area.
Yeah, and so in that way, that was Yeah.
That's
And learning
that's a good point, a contentious one. It will continue to come up in many other conflicts, but Philippi Village, in their process of building the cement wall, had engaged with early days leadership in Siengana, which was the other neighborhood next door to Waterfront. Waterfront only came around later. And that meant that Philippi Village had an established group of leadership from Siengana that they were willing to talk to. The problem was those people were maintaining their leadership roles in Siengana at the time, and they had no relationship with the Waterfront, at least from a formal, leadership relationship standpoint, even within the informal context. So then we had to explain to Philippi Village that the leadership of Siengana is not the leadership of the Waterfront, and they are not one and the same and don't belong to one another, and largely speaking have a bit of a drama with one another over land disputes and whatnot. And so that meant we had to establish who the leadership was, which partly we were able to do from that earlier survey work that Asanda was mentioning. So we kind of knew who the step up guys were. We kind of knew that they considered themselves leadership, and they would tell us that at least. And then this was, I think, really honestly, the first big test that they had as a leadership group. And I think some people that had considered themselves leadership fell away as a function of this.
Can you tell us a bit more about that group? Like, what type of people were there? Like personality-wise, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, there was one or two of them were kind of brash. One or two of them were extremely quiet, and one or two of them were kind of like the lead negotiators. So within that framework, there was kind of like, and you saw him earlier in your video, one of the guys was kind of always a bit of a brash, kind of loud negotiator, and considered himself, I think, leadership more by personality than by function.
Yeah, than by action.
And then there were a couple of guys that were sort of smaller, diminutive members of the community, but had been there a long time, who kind of considered themselves more the thinkers and the speakers. And then there were a couple of guys which fell away, who were more like they just were both quiet and not too forceful with their positions, and I think just kind of fatigued of having to be responsive all the time to the community needs hereafter. So we kind of lost a few in the process, and it kind of boiled down to 3 or 4 guys eventually. And I guess I should, as I say, all guys, it was all men that were considered leadership therein. The majority of it was single men living there. Some families, some single moms, a fair amount of children all together, but that wasn't the sort of norm in every house. And so those guys, I don't think they really knew. This was if I'm being really honest, and I could be wrong about this, but I don't get the sense they had a real process by which they were executing their leadership. Like, their meetings weren't really happening regularly. They really couldn't call community to meetings, and they really frequently couldn't speak on behalf of the community, because we would get then back to the negotiations, and the more community members would show up to the negotiation than would show up to the meetings. And so then we'd have to go back through all of these discussions, and the leadership would have to try to corral those people that have just now shown up to this event going on in public in the community and explain their interests, which they didn't always trust the leadership to relay.
That's interesting. So there was definitely a sort of a breakdown between what passed for the leadership and the community broadly.
Yeah.
I don't know if I would say there. I just want to reframe that quickly, and I do want you to come in, Asanda. I just would say not so much a breakdown as much as it was never built up.
Yeah, that's a better way to put it.
Yeah, no, Nate, in that case, I wasn't going to add much, but I think it's very important context to add that we're dealing with a community, quote unquote, but it had been developing and was forced to develop a leadership during this land invasion. And we were not only contending with the community members and the frustration and the anger and all of that from the general community members, but we've now been forced to help them put together a structure that can communicate to everyone, the message from our side. And I guess that's why I wanted to bring this up, because it wasn't just, there's a community group or a leadership group that we are dealing with. We are actually now forced to kind of assist them to build one and help them kind of manage that process as well, while trying to then negotiate them, off the land, basically.
So we give them the tents. That's sort of is the immediate, first day resolve thing. We actually, if I gave you a really honest timeline of it, and I think it's all in the brief, first day was all negotiations, and we got a verbal commitment not to come back onto the land based on our engagement in these negotiations. Second day, though, everything stalled. We just really couldn't move the concept forward, and that's why we ran around buying the tents for day 2. So it wasn't day 1; it was day 2. And because that negotiation stalled, we were getting more and more nervous that there wasn't going to be an answer that suited or that could prevent something from escalating. And that's why we went to buy those tents. I had researched them overnight and found out where we could get them, found out which locations had what stock, and got those. Now, the reason that I knew the tents wouldn't be, any reasonable person would know that the tents aren't a long-term solution to this, not even a medium-term, barely a short-term, if at all. Certainly not enviable to anyone. So when we learned and we could test out that they weren't being used, then that gave us a little bit more ability and grounds from which to say, actually, yes, this is a crisis. Yes, we want to solve this with you, but your point of having nowhere to go is clearly not true, because people are going somewhere. They're not going into these tents, they're going somewhere else. And while that's not ideal and not what we want either, it does mean that your claim that you have nowhere to be tonight is not our crisis point right now. Our crisis point is, what are we going to do to solve this problem? How do we get the people to the table that can help solve this problem? How does the government possibly come help pump this space? How does the landowner, whether it's the city or Oasis, which we didn't know at the time, come and deal with their responsibilities to this property? Because if it's not a tonight problem every day that we're negotiating, then we can start talking about what do we do to solve this problem. So Sean's here. I don't know if he's going to jump in at all. This was very early in Sean's time. So if he can hear me and he's rushing around or deciding to come to the mic, just jump in, Sean, when you do. But yeah, so that's where we're at here. And you've got Ricardo, you've got some maintenance workers from the community in Philippi Village. You've got me, and Leslie's the one that's sort of front of where we're all facing there. And I don't know if you've got other images loaded up at all, Douglas, of this negotiation or anything else you want to show. But you did show that video. So that's the CEO talking to me there. Theo's in the lower right corner. That's our team member from Nyanga that worked with us on Nyanga Yetu in one community, being our translator and trying to give me a bit of context where I missed the context.
So
and so we're just doing this triangulation. Yeah,
this is the moment when they got through the hole and started later on, after the negotiation, a group got through the hole and started pegging out stakes on the open patch of land, as seen from the Philippi Village building.
So Douglas, you're fast forwarding here. We're
sorry, that's am I jumping ahead?
That's totally fine, but because I don't know how much we want to try to get through today at this point. But that is a later invasion that then re-ups as the actual rainy season comes into Cape Town.
Right? Like but this later invasion wasn't that much later. It was it was actually the same day.
Oh.
This is also the 10th of June. This is just so this is at 1 o'clock.
No. So this wasn't the later invasion. The later invasion they actually staked out. That was a shot taken by security from from, or maybe even by Leslie for all I know.
No, by me. I took that picture.
Oh, from you, Douglas. Yeah. So that was a shot taken before we were able to plug the hole. By plug the hole, I mean get the community back into the neighborhood for these negotiations, right? That was them wandering around trying to figure out how to survey the property.
This was at 1 o'clock, and the next one, this one we started negotiating, was an hour before that. So this is actually an hour later. You had negotiated, and an hour later after this, they went through the hole and started digging.
Yeah, so that was because they didn't. Yeah, sorry, you can go ahead, but I think I have an idea of like what exactly.
No, I remember that there was the initial issue, and then the next one, which was when, if I'm not incorrect, that was the one where we had SAPs on ground. If I'm not incorrect.
Yeah, this later one was a bit more intense.
Yeah, that was the one where we'd done the initial engagement with them. And then we'd been. Yes, sorry. So there was the initial engagement, then it was those kinds of meetings in and meetings out. But then I think, Nate, you were pulled out of a meeting because now they'd been, trespassing again or coming back onto the land at the time. And then SAPS, this is when SAPS came in.
No, I'm getting confused here. So, sorry. All right. Can you give me... I just need a final answer on when was this photo taken as opposed to the video. Is it the same day? Is it a different day?
This was same day, an hour later.
Because it does not look that much different than the other time. But the other time they got much further along than this. They had actually staked out with wooden stakes the entire property, or that entire section of property. In this case, they were just on their initial walkthrough.
Right, I see.
No, I shouldn't say initial. This was on, we had receded, both of us, right?
Yeah.
So we had receded to make continued discussion of what can be done. And this was like one of the first times where they were supposed to be having a community meeting, but the community was like, yeah, right, bro, we're going. And so then we had to go back out, corral everyone back into the space, push the next meeting. Bushra used that as leverage against the leadership, saying, you can't control any of this. And so then they felt the need to kind of keep everyone in order for at least that day while we continued these sort of every 2-hour discussions and renegotiations. And so this was just like one of those in-between times where we're meeting and then suddenly we're looking outside at the property and going, oh, okay, this is all right, we got to get back out there.
Yeah, that's I think exactly what happened, because that was actually from our meeting room.
Yeah, I remember this moment because I was at the office, I think, at this point in time, but I remember at some kind of update, or it might have been afterwards, Nate, where you explained, okay, we spoke to them, we had the chat, we got them back over, stepped into a meeting to start making plans, and then you had to jump out of that meeting to re-engage with the community members who were coming back onto the land another time while they were trying to deliberate. Yeah, I remember this, at least, as far as some of your playbacks at the time.
Well, I suppose, like if I had to try to summarize this, because we can do play-by-plays and kind of renegotiate this over and over again. But the reality is, like, negotiating isn't fun. You don't sit down and go, what are your baseline concerns? What are your baseline concerns? Okay, let's come to an answer. It's just basically continuous re-engagement while everyone tries to screw it up. I mean, right now in the world, right, Trump is claiming to be negotiating 4 different peace processes or whatever, right? All of them failing, all of them doing nothing, mostly because he doesn't do anything and he's probably incapable of it. But broadly speaking, if Russia and Ukraine aren't talking, if Hamas and Israel aren't talking, then there's no progress being made. I mean, sometimes you have to let that happen, right? Because people need to settle in their spaces, make some decisions, change their motivations, change their baselines. But in general, it still takes so long to get everyone to a point where they're operating both within the boundaries of a negotiation, but also to settle in their minds on what's acceptable. People go into a thing demanding demanding the most and come out of these kinds of settlements getting, moderate amounts of what they want at best. And that was true in our case in this negotiation, which was that effectively we were going to try to support in various forms of development, try to push government to solve the watershed issue that they face continuously, to try to then deal with a handful of other issues. The problem being that the community, when they decided to, and it wasn't the leadership that broke through the wall, it was some guy with some sort of drill or saw that just decided, I'm done with this, I'm moving through.
It was just some individual unilaterally decided to take action,
right?
And that triggered the whole thing. Yeah.
Well, once he had, now everyone had expectations, right? Okay, let's get out of here. Let's go to this better land. So the leadership wasn't, as we were describing earlier, they weren't organized enough to be able to even themselves corral the expectations of that decision that the community took, right? And so a lot of it was pretty much triage, just how do we triage, figuratively triage this situation so that nothing happens immediately, and no one is suffering unnecessarily, but also no one is losing anything unnecessarily. So that was the sort of continuous process throughout the day as we negotiated at least 3 or 4 different times, and then settled on, okay, everyone needs to go find a place to stay tonight, and we'll be back in the morning for more negotiating. And so we, as the security agency, just sort of put somebody there, sort of pretty permanently. The idea was to have eyes on it at all times. I think we even we worked with Patrick to set up a makeshift fence wall at the end of that day, if memory serves. It wasn't that day, it was the next day. I think what we did was remove the fence from another side of the building to put it up there. Do you guys remember?
Yeah, I do. I think I even got a picture of that piece of fence.
And we had when was I might be misremembering, but when was the security container put up that side? Was that? We had to bring mover. That happens later on when we're doing the with the later solution, which we probably won't get to today, which happens after the next let me save that then. But there was also this might not be as important, because I think we've probably spoken about the major items, but I do think it's worth saying that we had been in discussions with the city at the time, particularly because there was a waterway leading out of Waterfront that would have been of assistance to them, but they kept throwing rubbish into it and blocking it, and meaning that no water was running through the waterway. I don't know if you guys remember, but I'm just looking through some of the documentation and thinking at the time
that waterway was here, right? It was this drain.
No. There's a waterway that drains water from the street into that watershed.
Was it that way around? Apologies. Yeah. No.
So this was our perennial problem of resolving this, because it just flooded the gate. But the problem that they had created for themselves was water could flow in from the surrounding area, right? But because there was so much trash there, when it would try to flux back out, it couldn't.
It wouldn't. Yeah, I remember something like that. We were just looking like, oh no! Not only is it like flooding and raining, but now there's this trash problem that's making it worse now.
Yeah.
And we've been trying to work with government to come in to clean that out.
Space. Yep.
Release the plug there, because there might have been later. That was later, I think.
It was a couple of days later. It was within that it was in the longer negotiation though. So what happens is after day 2, they don't use the tents. That relieves us of the sort of like humanitarian problem of it, at least for the time being. And then we negotiate, long story short, kind of like a continuous engagement process. So that means, and unfortunately, a lot of that falls on the lab, right? Safety Lab now is responsible to actually go through and kind of catalog the entire community. So figure out how many shacks there are, find out which ones are flooded, who lives in them, are they still around, bring those people and those people only to the next level of negotiating about what might happen next and what we can do in an emergency scenario to solve it. And to try to help people, especially people who may or may not have kids. We just didn't know who was in which houses at that time, to have a space that they could live from, right? And so that is that, but that becomes a process. So that's a process that we're engaging in order to manage this crisis. And that process wasn't aimed at immediate solves. It was aimed at longer term solves. So what can we do when the water goes down to prevent this from happening again? And what can we do in the short term to resolve these issues that all of these houses are facing? And more than that, how do we work together using our political connections, using the Safety Lab's political connections, using Philippi Village's financial and political connections, and then using the desires and needs of the community together to bring the government to heal on what their responsibilities are, as well as what we learned later on was Oasis, but that didn't work. But Oasis to also take responsibility for this. And so, effectively, it took us, I think, 3 days to kind of come up to negotiate a process forward that would include us and them together trying to build solutions, and then possibly, where feasible, add resource to those solutions.
Yeah. Goodness.
So how did it all end in the end? If you want to cover that quickly, and we can, I suppose, start.
So this one ended with a continuous process, right? I think our next one is going to have to be the crazier land invasion that comes months later.
Yeah, I think so too, because that one, and I'm proud of how far we managed to get in that one, but I do think it's a different one. Our response was different, and we were just better equipped for that one, and we really worked on solve now, and at least ensure that they're safe, they warm, they're taken care of, and I think that's its own story as well. So I agree with you, Nate. I think that one would be a good one as a follow-up.
Cool. So
I think it has to be, because it's full of different. I think as long as everyone's good for next week, but I think the next one is the one where things go a little bit more awry, and many more politics come into play, right? And a lot more solutioning. So if this were a show, this would be the end of episode 1 or season 1, and it would end with a montage of us doing canvassing around the homes, laughing and smiling and talking to people about what their needs are. Philippi Village kind of going back to its work as usual. The community kind of slowly finding a way to live within this new boundary that the water has created. While it never really goes down, it kind of trickles up and down throughout the rainy season, right? And in theory, all is calm and well, right? We're trying to get to the bottom of who lives here. We're trying to understand how many people live here. We're trying to make sure that the leadership process is germane. We're trying to come up with solutions with them that might work in the long run to prevent this from happening again, including things like setting up tire barriers around the water to make sure that, one, the land stays high enough and doesn't degrade into the waterfront, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's these sorts of things. We've got a fence up on the concrete wall. And in fact, I think then over the course of the next couple of days, you could add to the montage them replacing it, because it is until the next time when they actually rip it down again, where they never put up a new wall again. So as we finish that montage of happy endings, we can say next time on Philippi Village land invasion, we can put up house tearing down and red ants and Metro Police and SAPS police and fire on the land and fire burning down the field.
That was definitely later in the year when the ground was drier and tempers were hotter.
Yeah. So that one we can. That's next.
Yeah, the
On
container
Next
village.
time. It won't,
Yeah.
it
on,
won't be. It
on
won't
Adventures
be.
in the Safety Lab.
Yeah, next time on Adventures in the Safety Lab. It won't be next week. I've got to be off next week. Got commitments in this time frame. But the week thereafter.
Sound good?